The stars had a way of looking the same no matter how far you traveled from home. Thuron Vance had crossed 17 systems, walked on worlds where the gravity tried to crush him flat, and worlds where a careless step could send a man floating into the amber sky. And still, the stars looked exactly as they had from his childhood bedroom window on Mars. He supposed there was some comfort in that. The universe might be vast and terrifying and filled with things that wanted to kill you, but at least it was consistent about the decorations. He stood at the observation deck of the Meridian with his hands clasped behind his back and his reflection ghosting across the reinforced glass. The man looking back at him was 62 years old and looked every day of it. Gray had colonized his dark hair with the relentless efficiency of an invasion fleet. Lines had carved themselves into his face like river channels on a dying world. His eyes, which had once been described by a former lover as having the warmth of a tactical readout, had not improved with age. He looked, he thought, exactly like what he was, a military officer who had survived long enough to become someone else's problem. Below the observation deck, Velaris Prime rotated with the lazy confidence of a world that had been spinning for 4 billion years and saw no reason to rush. Its surface caught the light of the twin suns and scattered it into colors that human eyes were never meant to process. Violet and silver and shades of rose that seemed to exist only in the space between blinks. The planet was beautiful. Thuron had learned long ago to distrust beautiful things. They usually hid something sharp beneath the surface. The door behind him hissed open, and a voice that had been providing him with unwanted information for the past 6 hours continued its assault. Commander Vance, I should inform you that the Velari greeting ritual involves a specific configuration of the fingers that, if performed incorrectly, can convey romantic intentions toward the recipient's eldest living relative. Thuron did not turn around. Lieutenant Holloway, are you joking? I am absolutely not joking, sir. Petra Holloway stepped up beside him, her reflection joining his in the glass. She was 28, eager in a way that made Thuron feel ancient, and possessed the particular nervous energy of someone who had memorized every briefing document ever written and was terrified of forgetting a single comma. Her fingers were already fidgeting with her collar. The gesture involves the thumb positioned at a 40-degree angle, while the remaining fingers form a descending cascade that mimics the Velari concept of temporal flow. If the angle drops below 35 degrees, you are essentially asking to meet their grandmother in a courtship capacity. And if it goes above 45, then you have challenged them to ritual combat. Thuron finally turned to look at her. That seems like an unreasonably narrow margin for error. Velari culture places great emphasis on precision, sir. Velari culture sounds exhausting. Petra's face performed a complicated journey through several expressions before settling on something that might have been agreement disguised as professional neutrality. I can demonstrate the gesture if you would like. Please. She demonstrated. Her hands moved so quickly that Thuron registered only a vague impression of fingers doing something probably important. Could you do that again? Slower this time. She did it again. It was not noticeably slower. Again. 7 demonstrations later, Thuron had learned that he could reliably produce a gesture that fell somewhere between declaring war and proposing marriage, and that Petra was developing a twitch above her left eye that suggested she was reconsidering her career choices. He told her that if he accidentally ended up engaged to someone's elderly relative, he would make sure to mention in the wedding speech that his diplomatic aide had done her very best. She did not seem comforted by this. The Meridian's captain announced their approach to orbital position, and the observation deck's windows automatically adjusted their tint to compensate for the increasing light. Velaris Prime swelled beneath them like a jewel being lifted toward the sun. Thuron watched the planet grow and tried to remember the last time he had seen it. 20 years ago. A different ship, a different mission, a different man wearing his face and making decisions that would follow him for the rest of his life. He had been 38 during the Great Siege. Old enough to know better, young enough to still believe that knowing better and doing better were somehow connected. The Terran expansion fleet had surrounded Velaris Prime with enough firepower to crack the planet's crust, and the Velari had refused to surrender. They were not a warrior species by nature. Their technology was strange and beautiful and focused on things humans barely understood. Harmonic resonance, crystalline consciousness, the manipulation of light as though it were a physical substance. But they had looked at the human armada hanging in their sky, and they had said no. They had said that some things were worth dying for. Thuron had been assigned to the strike wing, targeting the Temple of Resonance. Military intelligence had classified it as a command center. Cultural intelligence, which apparently nobody had consulted, would have told them it was the spiritual heart of Velari civilization, a place where their people had gathered for ceremonies and meditation for longer than humans had possessed written language. His orders were clear: destroy the target, neutralize enemy morale, except that some eggs needed breaking if you wanted to cook an omelet the size of a planetary surrender. He had descended through the atmosphere with his weapons armed and his targeting computer singing its quiet song of mathematical destruction. He had watched the temple grow in his display, watched the coordinates lock, watched his finger hover over the authorization panel. And then the smoke had cleared for just a moment, and he had seen them. Hundreds of Velari civilians huddled in the courtyard, their pale gray skin catching the firelight, their long tapered ears pressed flat against their skulls in that gesture he would later learn meant absolute terror. He had seen a woman clutching a child to her chest, looking up at his descending gunship as though she could somehow reach across the impossible distance and meet his eyes. He had powered down his weapons. He had turned his ship away. His commanders had screamed at him through the communication channel, their voices layered over each other like a chorus of bureaucratic fury. He had ignored them. He had flown his gunship back to the carrier and walked directly to the brig and turned himself in for insubordination before anyone could officially order him to do so. The war had ended 3 weeks later, not because of him, because a Velari scientist had demonstrated a weapon that could have reduced the entire human fleet to its component atoms, and then had chosen not to use it. Mutual destruction, as it turned out, was an excellent foundation for peace negotiations. Thuron had been quietly released, quietly promoted, and quietly shuffled into diplomatic assignments where his tendency to make inconvenient decisions could be channeled into something resembling usefulness. 20 years. He had spent 20 years not thinking about Velaris Prime, and now here he was, watching it fill his window like an old wound reopening. "Sir." Petra's voice pulled him back to the present. "The escort vessels are arriving." He looked up and felt his breath catch despite himself. The Velari ships materialized around the meridian like thoughts taking physical form. Their hulls were grown from living crystal, surfaces rippling with light that seemed to come from within rather than reflecting from without. They moved without visible propulsion, sliding through space as though the vacuum itself was carrying them forward. Human scientists had been trying to explain Velari technology for decades. The best theory involved quantum entanglement and exotic matter. The second best theory, proposed by a physicist who had clearly given up, simply stated that the Velari had apparently decided the laws of physics were suggestions. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Petra said quietly. "Terrifying," Thuron corrected. "Beautiful and terrifying are not mutually exclusive." The escort vessels took up formation around the meridian, and the combined fleet began its descent toward the planet's surface. Thuron watched the atmosphere approach, watched the first tendrils of color begin to lick at the ship's shields, watched the stars disappear behind curtains of violet and silver light. He thought about the woman he had seen 20 years ago, the one clutching her child in the courtyard of a temple he had been ordered to destroy. He wondered if she was still alive. He wondered if she remembered his face. He wondered if coming here was the bravest thing he had ever done, or the most foolish. The transport shuttle was waiting in the Meridian's hangar bay, a sleek diplomatic vessel designed to look impressive rather than functional. Thuron walked toward it with Petra trailing behind him, still reciting cultural briefings at a pace that suggested she believed his brain could download information directly from her voice. He learned that Velari did not shake hands. He learned that direct eye contact lasting more than 3 seconds was considered a challenge. He learned that the color yellow was associated with mourning. He stopped walking. What was that last one? Yellow is associated with mourning, sir. It represents the fading of light, the transition between life and death. Wearing yellow to a diplomatic function would be considered deeply inappropriate. Thuron looked down at his travel bag. He looked back at Petra. He looked down at his bag again. Sir, please tell me you did not pack exclusively yellow clothing as some sort of culturally sensitive gesture. I was told that yellow represented respect for the fallen. I was attempting to acknowledge the losses from the war. Petra closed her eyes. Her twitch had returned with reinforcements. Who told you that, sir? Admiral Chen's cultural liaison. Admiral Chen's cultural liaison is either profoundly incompetent or actively trying to sabotage this mission. Those options are not mutually exclusive either. They stood in silence for a moment, contemplating the implications. Then Petra squared her shoulders with the determination of someone who had just added dress yourself to her list of responsibilities and gestured toward the shuttle. I will arrange for appropriate clothing to be delivered to your quarters on the surface, sir. In the meantime, I suggest we proceed before the Velari delegation begins to wonder if we are having second thoughts. Thuron walked up the shuttle's ramp and settled into a seat that had clearly been designed for comfort by someone who had never actually sat in anything. He strapped himself in, watched Petra do the same, and felt the subtle vibration as the shuttle's engines powered up. Through the small window beside him, he could see the hangar bay doors opening onto a sky that was no longer black but alive with color. He was going back. After 20 years of avoiding it, after 2 decades of pretending that one moment of mercy had been enough, he was returning to the world he had almost destroyed. The Terran Council believed they were sending him as a symbol, a reminder that humans could choose peace. The Velari probably believed they were receiving a ghost, a legend wrapped in aging flesh. Thuron did not know what he believed anymore. He only knew that the woman's face from 20 years ago had never quite faded from his memory, and that somewhere on the crystalline surface below, answers were waiting that he was not sure he wanted to find. The shuttle dropped through the atmosphere, and Velaris Prime rose up to meet him. The descent through the atmosphere of Velaris Prime was unlike anything Thuron had experienced in 4 decades of space travel. The shuttle did not shake or rattle or give any indication that it was pushing through layers of gas at tremendous speed. Instead, the world outside the window simply changed, as though someone was adjusting the settings on a display screen. The black of space gave way to deep purple, then to violet, then to shades of rose and amber that seemed to exist in colors his eyes had not previously known how to see. He found himself gripping the armrest of his uncomfortable seat and forcing his fingers to relax. He was a veteran of 17 systems. He would not be unnerved by a sunset. Petra had stopped reciting briefings and was staring out her own window with an expression that suggested she was reconsidering whether diplomatic service had been the right career choice after all. Her mouth was slightly open. Her twitch had temporarily retreated in the face of more immediate concerns. "Lieutenant," Thuron said, "are you all right?" "The sky is singing, sir." He listened. She was right. There was a sound coming from somewhere outside the shuttle, a low harmonic tone that seemed to resonate in his chest rather than his ears. It rose and fell with the changing colors, as though the atmosphere itself was producing music. "That would be the crystalline layer," Petra said, recovering enough to slip back into briefing mode. The upper atmosphere contains suspended particles of resonant crystal that vibrate at specific frequencies when disturbed by entering vessels. The Velari consider it a form of welcome. And if the frequency is wrong, Then it would be a form of warning. How can you tell the difference? Petra paused. I am not entirely certain, sir. The shuttle continued its descent, and the singing sky gave way to a landscape that made Thuron understand why poets wrote about this world. The city of Thessaly spread beneath them like a dream rendered in glass and light. Spires of violet crystal rose from the ground at angles that defied human architectural sensibility, connected by bridges that appeared to be made of frozen light. The streets were not streets at all but canals of liquid crystal that caught the twin suns and scattered their radiance into 1,000 fractured rainbows. Buildings breathed. He could see it even from this altitude, the slow pulse of bioluminescence that moved through the structures like a heartbeat. The shuttle touched down on a landing platform that materialized beneath them as they approached. Thuron had read about Velari adaptive architecture, the way their buildings could reshape themselves according to need, but reading about something and watching a solid platform assemble itself from thin air were very different experiences. He unbuckled his restraints and stood slowly, giving his legs a moment to remember their purpose. The shuttle door opened, and the air of Velaris Prime entered like a guest who had been waiting impatiently outside. It was warm and carried a faint sweetness that Thuron could not identify. It also carried sound, that same harmonic resonance from the atmosphere, but layered now with other tones. The city was singing too. Everything on this world seemed to be singing. A delegation waited at the edge of the platform. Thuron counted 7 Velari officials arranged in a pattern that his briefings told him indicated formal welcome with reservations. Their pale gray skin caught the ambient light and seemed to glow from within. Their long tapered ears were oriented toward him with an attentiveness that he found slightly unnerving. Ears should not be that expressive. Ears should stay where you put them and mind their own business. He descended the shuttle ramp with Petra at his shoulder and stopped at the prescribed distance. 3 meters, close enough to converse, far enough to indicate respect for personal boundaries. He raised his hand to perform the greeting gesture and felt Petra tense beside him. The moment stretched. His fingers formed the configuration that Petra had demonstrated 17 times. 40-degree angle, descending cascade, temporal flow. He held the gesture and waited. The lead official, a tall Velari with silver threading through her dark hair and ears that seemed longer than the others, studied his hand with an expression that gave away nothing. Then she mirrored the gesture, and Thuron let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "Commander Vance," the official said. Her voice had the musical quality common to all Velari speech, but there was ice beneath the melody. "The Harmonic Council acknowledges your arrival. I am Counselor Velithrin, appointed to oversee your delegation's activities during your stay. Counselor, the Terran Council sends its regards and its hopes for productive dialogue." "I am certain they do." Her ears rotated slightly, a gesture Thuron's briefings had not covered. "You will be escorted to the diplomatic quarter. The Harmonic Council will receive you formally tomorrow morning. Until then, you will remain within the designated areas." "Of course. Your reputation precedes you, Commander." Velithrin's amber eyes met his, holding the contact for exactly 2.5 seconds before sliding away. "Not all of it is welcome here." She turned without waiting for a response and led the delegation toward the edge of the platform, where a vessel waited in the crystal canal below. The vessel looked like it had been grown rather than built, its hull a seamless curve of violet glass that pulsed with inner light. Thuron followed, keeping his face neutral, keeping his thoughts to himself. He had expected hostility. He had not expected it to be quite so elegant. The journey through Thessaly took them along canals that wound between the breathing spires like veins through a body. Velari citizens lined the banks, watching the human delegation pass. Thuron sat in the vessel's central compartment and tried not to stare back at them. Their faces showed the range of emotions he had anticipated. Hatred, fear, suspicion, the tightly controlled anger of people who had not forgotten what humans had done to their world. But there were other expressions too, ones that made him deeply uncomfortable. Some of them were looking at him with hope. "They know who you are," Petra said quietly. She had taken the seat beside him and was watching the crowds with the analytical attention of someone cataloging data for a future report. "Word of your identity must have spread faster than the official channels anticipated. I noticed. Some of them seem almost pleased to see you, sir." "I noticed that too." A child on the canal bank raised a hand and waved. The gesture was unmistakably friendly, unmistakably directed at him. The child's mother pulled the small figure back and bent to whisper something in those long, expressive ears, but not before the child had smiled at him with the uncomplicated joy of youth. Thuron turned away from the window. The diplomatic quarter was a complex of buildings arranged around a central courtyard, where a fountain of liquid light rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost intentional. His assigned quarters occupied the third floor of a structure that hummed faintly when he touched its walls. The room was spacious, filled with furniture that had clearly been designed for Velari proportions. The chair offered to him reached approximately to his mid-thigh. The bed, if that was what it was, appeared to be a shallow depression filled with something that looked like luminescent moss. "I am going to sleep on the floor," he announced to no one in particular. Petra appeared in the doorway with a data tablet clutched to her chest. "Sir, your clothing situation has been addressed. A selection of appropriate garments will arrive within the hour. I have taken the liberty of specifying colors that will not accidentally declare war or initiate courtship." "I appreciate that, Lieutenant." "There is also the matter of your quarters, sir." She glanced around the room with the expression of someone trying very hard not to say what she was thinking. "The Velari have attempted to decorate in what they believe to be traditional human fashion." Thuron looked around properly for the first time. In the corner stood a creature that had been taxidermied with more enthusiasm than skill. It had 6 legs, fur that might have been orange once, and a facial expression that suggested it had died in a state of profound confusion. On the wall hung a painting that was clearly meant to represent Earth, but featured 3 moons, and what appeared to be a volcano actively erupting butterflies. A shelf held a collection of objects that might have been human artifacts if humans had designed artifacts while experiencing fever dreams. "Is that a toaster?" he asked, pointing to something on the shelf. "I believe they think it is a religious icon, sir." "And that?" He indicated a small statue that seemed to depict a human figure with an excessive number of arms. "Historical figure. They appear to have confused several different cultural traditions." Thuron walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard below, where the fountain of light continued its endless dance. The twin suns were setting now, painting the crystal spires in shades of deep violet and gold. It was beautiful. Everything on this world was beautiful. And somewhere in this city, there were people who remembered what he had done 20 years ago, people who had built stories around his one moment of defiance, people who expected him to be something more than a tired old soldier following orders he had not asked for. "Lieutenant," he said without turning around, "do you know why they really sent me here?" Petra was silent for a moment. "The official reason is that you represent a symbol of human willingness to choose peace. And the unofficial reason?" "I suspect, sir, that some people believe you will make the Velari more compliant, that your presence will remind them that even during the war, there were humans who showed restraint, that they will be more likely to accept unfavorable terms if they believe those terms come from someone who once spared their sacred temple. Someone in the council thinks I am a weapon. Several someones, I would imagine." Thuron nodded slowly. It was what he had expected. The Terran Council did not believe in symbols that could not be leveraged. They had sent him here because they thought his history would make him useful, would make the Velari trust him enough to accept compromises they would otherwise reject. They were using his one act of mercy as a negotiating tool. The question was whether they were right to do so. The question was whether the man who had turned his weapons off 20 years ago still existed somewhere inside the officer who had spent 2 decades learning to follow orders. The question was whether mercy, once offered, could ever really be taken back. He watched the sun sink below the crystal horizon and waited for tomorrow to bring him answers he was not sure he wanted. The morning arrived with a sound that Thuron initially mistook for an alarm. He lurched upright from his position on the floor, hand reaching for a weapon that was not there, heart pounding against his ribs like something trying to escape. Then his brain caught up with his instincts, and he realized that the sound was not an alarm at all. The city was singing its dawn chorus. Every crystal spire, every glass bridge, every pulsing wall was resonating with the light of the rising suns, producing harmonies that built upon each other until the air itself seemed to vibrate with welcome. He lay back down on the floor and stared at the ceiling, which was also faintly glowing. He had slept for perhaps 4 hours. The luminescent moss bed had proven even less appealing upon closer inspection, and the floor, while hard, at least had the virtue of not appearing to be alive. A chime at his door announced Petra's arrival. She entered without waiting for permission, carrying a bundle of fabric in colors that would apparently neither declare war nor propose marriage. "Good morning, sir. The formal reception begins in 2 hours. I have prepared a schedule of protocols that you should review before we depart." "How long is the schedule?" 17 pages, sir." "Summarize it." Petra's eye twitched. It was becoming a familiar sight. Do not make prolonged eye contact. Do not touch anyone without invitation. Do not mention the war unless they mention it first. Do not eat anything purple. Why not purple? It is considered sacred. Consumption of purple food items by non-Velari is deeply offensive. What if everything is purple? This entire planet appears to be purple. Then you should not eat anything, sir. Thuron accepted the clothing and retreated behind a partition to change. The garments were surprisingly comfortable, flowing robes in shades of deep blue and silver that somehow managed to fit his human proportions despite clearly being Velari in design. He suspected Petra had spent considerable time negotiating with local tailors while he had been attempting to sleep on the floor. When he emerged, she studied him with the critical eye of someone assessing a military formation. "Acceptable," she pronounced, "though you may wish to do something about your hair." "What is wrong with my hair?" "It appears to have made several independent decisions during the night, sir." He found a reflective surface and confirmed that his hair had indeed staged a small rebellion. He flattened it with his hands and achieved a result that could generously be called presentable. Petra did not comment further, which he chose to interpret as approval. The journey to the Chamber of Resonance took them through sections of the city that Thuron had not seen the day before. The morning light transformed Thessaly into something that belonged in dreams rather than reality. Crystal structures caught the twin suns and fractured their radiance into cascading rainbows that danced across every surface. The canals of liquid crystal flowed with colors that shifted as he watched, responding to some rhythm he could not perceive. And everywhere, the Velari moved through their city with a grace that made human locomotion seem crude by comparison. Their vessel deposited them at the base of a spire that rose higher than any structure Thuron had ever seen. The Chamber of Resonance occupied its upper levels, accessible by a lift system that appeared to operate on principles that involved neither cables nor visible machinery. He stepped into the lift beside Petra and felt his stomach drop as they ascended at a speed that suggested the Velari did not share humanity's concerns about acceleration. "Sir," Petra said as they rose, "I should warn you that the Harmonic Council may attempt to unsettle you with unexpected elements. This is a standard negotiating tactic in Velari diplomatic tradition." "What sort of unexpected elements?" "I do not know, sir. That is rather the point of them being unexpected." The lift slowed and opened onto a corridor of violet glass. The walls sang softly as they passed, responding to their movement with tones that followed them like curious animals. Thuron kept his pace measured, his expression neutral, his hands visible at his sides. He had walked into hostile negotiations before. He had faced down admirals and ambassadors, and at least one planetary governor who had attempted to have him assassinated over a trade dispute. He could handle a room full of Velari politicians. The corridor ended at doors that seemed to be made of condensed light. They parted as he approached, and the chamber of resonance opened before him. The space was vast. The ceiling rose so high that it disappeared into shadow, or perhaps into light. The distinction was unclear. Walls of violet glass curved around a central dais where the Harmonic Council sat in elevated positions that required Thuron to look up at them. Silver light filtered through crystalline windows and cast prismatic shadows that moved across the floor in patterns too regular to be random. The air hummed with barely audible frequencies that seemed to press against his skin. He walked forward to the position marked for him, 3 meters from the dais, and stopped. The greeting gesture, 40 degrees, descending cascade. He had practiced it so many times that his fingers moved without conscious thought. The council returned the gesture. 7 Velari in robes of deep purple, their long ears oriented toward him with unsettling attention, their amber eyes reflecting the silver light like captured flames. Counselor Velithrin sat at the center, her expression as cold as it had been at the landing platform. "Commander Thuron Vance," she said, her voice filling the chamber without apparent effort. "You stand before the Harmonic Council as a representative of the Terran government. Speak your purpose." He had prepared a speech. Petra had written it, revised it, and made him memorize it word for word. It was diplomatic and careful, and said nothing of substance while appearing to say everything important. He opened his mouth to deliver it. The doors behind the dais opened. A young woman entered the chamber, and something in the atmosphere shifted. She was Velari, her skin the pale gray of her people, her ears long and elegantly tapered. But there was something different about her, something that made Thuron's prepared words evaporate from his mind. She moved toward the dais with a purpose that seemed at odds with the formal setting, her amber eyes scanning the chamber until they found him. They locked onto his face with the force of a targeting system. He watched recognition dawn in those eyes, watched her steps falter, watched her hand rise to press against her chest as though something had struck her there. Her lips parted. Her ears pressed back against her skull in an expression that his briefings told him indicated overwhelming emotion. "Mother," she breathed, her voice carrying through the singing air of the chamber. "It is him. It is him." The Harmonic Council stirred. Velithrin turned to look at the young woman with an expression that mixed irritation with something more complicated. But before anyone could speak, another figure emerged from the shadows behind the dais. She was older than the young woman, her dark hair threaded with silver, her face carrying the lines of years that had not all been kind. But her eyes were the same luminous amber, and when they met Thuron's, he felt the floor shift beneath his feet. He knew her. 20 years of carefully constructed distance collapsed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He knew the shape of her face because he had seen it through smoke and fire, looking up at his gunship from the courtyard of a temple. He knew her eyes because they had met his across an impossible distance, and asked him a question that his commanders could not hear. He knew her because he had pulled her from the rubble of a collapsed building while his earpiece screamed at him to return to formation, had felt her hand grip his arm with desperate strength, had heard her whisper something in Velari that his translator could not parse, but that his heart had somehow understood. The woman from the temple, the woman with the child. She was looking at him now as though he were a ghost made flesh, and the young woman beside her was looking at him as though he were something even more impossible than that. "Commander Vance," the older woman said, and her voice was exactly as he remembered it, musical and rough and carrying weight that words alone could not explain. "I am Valithra, and this is my daughter Saralyn. I believe you and I have met before." The chamber had gone silent. The council members were watching with expressions that ranged from confusion to alarm. Petra, somewhere behind him, had stopped breathing. And Thuron stood in the center of it all, his diplomatic speech forgotten, his careful preparations meaningless, facing the consequences of a decision he had made 20 years ago when he was still young enough to believe that single acts of mercy could change the course of history. "I remember," he said. His voice sounded strange in his own ears. "I remember you." Saralyn made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. Her eyes were bright with tears that caught the silver light and transformed them into tiny prisms. "You are real," she whispered. "All my life I thought perhaps the story was exaggerated. Perhaps the human who saved us was not quite as my mother described. But you are real. You are exactly as she said." Thuron did not know how to respond to that. He did not know how to stand in front of a young woman who had apparently grown up with his face on her nightstand and his story in her heart. He did not know how to look at Valithra and see the woman from the rubble and the mother of a child he had inadvertently given a future. "I am real," he said finally, "though I suspect I am rather less impressive than whatever story you were told." Saralyn laughed, a sound that cut through the tension of the chamber like light through crystal. "My mother said you would be modest. She said that humans who do remarkable things often do not recognize the remarkableness of their actions. Your mother gives me too much credit. I simply chose not to follow orders that would have made me a murderer." "And yet," Valithra said, stepping forward until she stood at the edge of the dais, looking down at him with those amber eyes that had haunted him for 2 decades, "that simple choice gave my daughter her life, gave our people hope, gave me a story to tell when others claimed that humans were incapable of mercy." She descended from the dais, moving with a grace that age had not diminished. The council members shifted in their seats but did not intervene. Petra made a small sound of alarm that Thuron ignored. Valithra stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the silver threads in her hair, the pulse beating in her throat. 20 years, she said softly. "I have waited 20 years to say this to your face. Thank you, Commander Vance. Thank you for my life. Thank you for my daughter. Thank you for proving that the universe is not as cruel as it sometimes appears." Thuron felt something shift in his chest, something that had been locked away for a very long time. He looked at Valithra and saw the woman he remembered, older now but no less fierce. He looked at Saralyn and saw the child she must have been, the child who had grown into a woman carrying the weight of his one decision like a torch against the dark. "You are welcome," he said, because there was nothing else to say. "Though I am not sure I deserve quite so much gratitude for simply being unable to commit atrocity." Saralyn laughed again, and this time the sound was warmer, lighter. "He is modest and stubborn, exactly as you described, Mother." "He has had 20 years to practice being stubborn," Valithra said. "I imagine he has become quite skilled at it by now." The council members were still watching, their expressions a complicated mix of emotions that Thuron could not read. Velithrin in particular looked as though she had swallowed something unpleasant. But for this moment, in this chamber of violet glass and silver light, none of that seemed to matter. What mattered was the woman in front of him, and the daughter beside her, and the impossible weight of 20 years of gratitude pressing against his chest like something trying to break free. The private chambers where Valithra led him were smaller than the grand hall, lined with woven crystal that absorbed sound, and created an intimacy that felt almost uncomfortable after the vastness of the chamber of resonance. Saralyn followed close behind, her amber eyes never leaving his face for more than a few seconds at a time. Petra had attempted to accompany them, but had been gently redirected by Velari attendants to a waiting area where, Thuron suspected, she was currently having a quiet crisis about protocol violations. The door sealed behind them with a soft harmonic tone, and suddenly the 3 of them were alone. The weight of 20 years pressed down on the room like atmosphere on a descending shuttle. Valithra gestured to a seating arrangement that had clearly been designed for Velari proportions. Thuron lowered himself onto a chair that brought his knees uncomfortably close to his chest, and decided that dignity was overrated. Sarah Lynn sat across from him, perched on the edge of her seat as though she might need to leap up at any moment. Her mother took a position between them, her posture suggesting someone who had been preparing for this conversation for a very long time. "I have imagined this meeting often," Valethra said. Her voice was softer now, stripped of the formal cadence she had used in the chamber. "In my imagination, I always knew exactly what to say. Now I find that words seem insufficient." "But I have that effect on conversations," Thuron offered. "Usually because I have said something inappropriate about someone's grandmother." Sarah Lynn made a sound that was half laugh, half confusion. "Is that a human custom?" "It is a diplomatic hazard involving hand gestures that I would rather not explain." Valethra's lips curved into something approaching a smile. "You deflect with humor. My daughter does the same thing when she is uncomfortable." "A universal survival mechanism, apparently." The moment of lightness faded, and the room settled back into its previous weight. Sarah Lynn leaned forward, her long ears angled toward him with an attentiveness that he found both endearing and slightly unnerving. "Commander Vance," she said, "may I ask you something that I have wondered about my entire life?" "You may ask. I cannot promise the answer will satisfy you." "Why did you do it?" Not the official reason, not the story that gets told in briefings and histories. The real reason. In that moment, when your weapons were armed and your orders were clear, what made you choose differently? Thuron was silent for a long moment. He had asked himself the same question countless times over the past 2 decades. He had given different answers depending on who was asking and what they wanted to hear. But looking at Sarah Lynn now, looking at the hope burning in her amber eyes, he found that he wanted to give her the truth. "I saw your mother," he said simply. "I saw her holding a child in the courtyard of a temple, looking up at my gunship as though she could somehow reach me. And I realized that if I followed my orders, I would have to live with her face for the rest of my life. I would have to carry the knowledge that I had killed her and everyone around her because someone in a command center told me to." He paused, searching for words that had never quite existed for what he needed to express. "I was not brave," he continued. "I was not noble. I was simply unable to become the kind of person who could do what they asked me to do. The choice was selfish, in its way. I chose my own conscience over my duty because I could not bear the alternative." Sarah Lynn's eyes glistened with moisture that caught the ambient light. "You call that selfish? I call it the most generous thing anyone has ever done for me." "Your daughter speaks truth," Valethra said. "Whatever your reasons, Commander, the result was the same. You gave us our lives. You gave our people a story that has sustained hope through 20 years of difficult peace." She rose from her seat and moved to a shelf along the wall, retrieving a small object that she carried back to him with careful reverence. It was a holographic display, the kind that could store images and project them into the air. She activated it, and suddenly Thuron was looking at his own face, younger by 2 decades, captured from what must have been military records. "This has sat beside my daughter's bed since she was 5 years old," Valethra said. "She used to talk to it before she slept. She would tell you about her day, ask you questions, imagine your answers." "Mother," Sarah Lynn said, her gray skin flushing with what Thuron recognized as embarrassment even across species lines. "Perhaps we do not need to share every detail. She once got into a physical altercation with a classmate who suggested that humans were incapable of kindness." Valethra continued, ignoring her daughter's protests. "She was suspended from her educational institution for 3 days. I told her I was disappointed in her behavior. I did not tell her that I was also proud." Thuron looked at the hologram of his younger self and felt something shift in his chest. He had spent 20 years believing that his one act of defiance had been a footnote, a moment of weakness that his commanders had covered up and his colleagues had forgotten. He had not known that somewhere on this crystalline world, a child had been growing up with his face as a symbol of hope. "I do not know if I can be what you have made me," he said quietly. I have spent 2 decades following orders and compromising, and becoming the kind of officer who does not make inconvenient decisions. The man in that hologram might be a stranger to me now. Saralyn stood and crossed the space between them. She knelt beside his awkward chair, bringing her amber eyes level with his, and took his hand in both of hers. Her skin was cool and smooth, her grip surprisingly strong. "Then let us help you find him again," she said. "The diplomatic mission, the territorial disputes, the positioning for political advantage, none of that has to end the way the politicians want it to end. There are people here who believe that peace is possible. Real peace, not the armed truce we have been living under for 20 years. But we need someone on the human side who is willing to choose differently again." Thuron looked at her, at the hope burning in her eyes, at the faith she had carried since childhood. He looked at Valithra, at the woman he had pulled from rubble, at the mother who had raised her daughter on stories of human mercy. He thought about Admiral Chen and the Terran Council, about their plans to use him as a weapon wrapped in the language of diplomacy. He thought about the man he had been at 38, the man who had turned his weapons off because he could not live with the alternative. "What would you have me do?" he asked. Valithra stepped forward, her expression shifting to something harder and more practical. "There is a faction within our government that wants this negotiation to fail. Councillor Dravathan and his allies profit from tension with humanity. They have been sabotaging diplomatic efforts for years, manufacturing incidents to justify military buildup. We have evidence, but we cannot use it without corroboration from your side. You want me to help you expose a conspiracy. I want you to help us save both our peoples from a war that nobody wants, but many will profit from." Thuron was silent. The request was reasonable, even righteous, but it would mean betraying the trust of his own government, taking actions that could end his career and possibly his freedom. It would mean becoming, once again, the kind of man who made inconvenient decisions. He looked at Saralyn, still kneeling beside him, still holding his hand. He thought about the child she had been, talking to his hologram before sleep. He thought about all the children on both worlds who would grow up in the shadow of war if people like Dravathan and Admiral Chen had their way. "I will need access to your evidence," he said, "and I will need to verify it independently before I take any action." Saralyn's face broke into a smile that transformed her features from merely striking to genuinely beautiful. "Then you will help us." "I will help you find the truth. What happens after that depends on what the truth turns out to be." It was enough. Valithra nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose gamble had paid off. Saralyn squeezed his hand once more before releasing it and rising to her feet. And Thuron sat in his awkward chair in the private chambers of a crystalline world, feeling something stir in his chest that he had not felt in 20 years. Hope. It was hope. The dangerous, inconvenient, utterly human sensation of believing that things could be different. The weeks that followed were a blur of secret meetings and stolen data and conversations conducted in the singing shadows of Velari architecture. Thuron worked with Saralyn and her network of allies, piecing together a picture of coordinated sabotage that spanned both governments. He discovered that Admiral Chen's cultural liaison had not been incompetent after all. The yellow shirts, the diplomatic incidents, the manufactured tensions had all been part of a deliberate effort to undermine peace. When the evidence was finally assembled, when the truth was undeniable, Thuron stood before the Harmonic Council and the Terran Diplomatic Corps and laid it all bare. He named names. He presented proof. He watched careers collapse and alliances shatter and felt no satisfaction in any of it, only the grim recognition that this was what choosing differently actually looked like. The peace treaty was signed 3 months later. It was not perfect. It was not the complete resolution that idealists on both sides had hoped for, but it was real, and it was built on a foundation that did not include manufactured hatred. On his last day on Velaris Prime, Thuron stood on a balcony overlooking the crystal canals of Thessaly, watching the twin suns paint the sky in colors that still seemed impossible. Saralyn found him there, as he had known she would. "You are leaving," she said. "It was not a question. My work here is finished. The council wants me back on Earth for debriefing and probably a quiet reassignment to somewhere I cannot cause trouble. You could stay. There are people here who would welcome you." He turned to look at her, at this young woman who had grown up with his face as a symbol of hope and who had helped him find the man he used to be. "Perhaps someday. But first I need to go home and remember who I am when I am not being a legend." Saralyn smiled, and there was understanding in her amber eyes. "The man who saved our temple 20 years ago, is he still in there?" Thuron considered the question. He thought about the choices he had made in the past weeks, the risks he had taken, the convenient career he had sacrificed for inconvenient truth. He thought about the tired old soldier he had been when he arrived, and the something else he had become. "I think he might be," he said. "Thanks to you and your mother, I think he might finally be finding his way back." She stepped forward and embraced him, her arms wrapping around him with a warmth that transcended the differences between their species. He returned the embrace, holding her gently, feeling the steady pulse of her alien heartbeat against his chest. "Thank you," she whispered, "for coming back, for choosing differently again." "Thank you," he replied, "for believing I could." The shuttle carried him away from Velaris Prime an hour later, rising through the singing atmosphere and into the star-scattered black. Thuron watched the crystalline world shrink beneath him and felt something settle in his chest. Not completion, exactly. Not an ending. More like